I remember here. Seth received his bachelor's in psychology and childhood development from ECU, and then a master's in public administration from the City University of New York. He's worked in program development, fundraising, and leadership in the nonprofit sector for 24 years and is now serving as Chief Executive Officer of Passage Home since 2018. Let us give a warm Rotary welcome to Seth Friedman. Welcome, Seth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you all having me here today. And I have, a very free-flowing presentation style, especially over Zoom. So feel free to jump in, ask questions. I'll ask some questions of you guys throughout. So feel free to unmute, stay unmuted, and just jump in. My first question is, had anybody had the chance to read the book, The Lynching? I know there was a suggestion of a book that I sent. Did anybody have a chance to read it?
I have started it, but I have not finished it.
Okay. Well, the reason I bring it up and the reason I sent that book specifically was for several reasons. I think, especially in a lot of our circles recently, the same books have been getting passed around. White Fragility, The Color of Law, things like that. And I think those books are great. And The Color of Law, for anybody that's interested, is on Hoopla now, which is an audio format, so you can listen to it while you go for walks. But for a lot of those books, I think it's a lot of key tenets that are really important, but are kind of regurgitated over and over again. And The Lynching was, a little bit anecdotal, based on, some interviews, some stories. But what I found most compelling about it was a book about an event that took place in the 80s with some drawbacks to the 1960s, but how everything that happened back then could have been moved to today and has very clear and similar parallels. So for anybody that read the book, it talks a lot about George Wallace at points during it. And when George Wallace, and I haven't read it in a while, but when George Wallace was running for governor of Alabama, does anybody know what his slogan was? And it's in the book, it's not. So I'll go ahead and say it was "Keep Alabama Southern." Does that sound familiar to anything that's happening today in slogans? Very similar. When I first read it, it was "Make America Great Again." Had a very similar slogan, but now it's "Keep America Great." Very similar, and those great could be changed to Southern and have the same impact. And the other thing that really stuck out, a couple of other things, was President Trump, or Donald Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, plays a large role in this. Again, a prominent figure in the 70s and 80s, still prominent then. And he had a famous quote, and many of you may have heard this quote outside of the book, but one of the quotes he had in the book was, the Ku Klux Klan isn't so bad, except for they smoke all that weed. So less concerned about the racism, more concerned about the marijuana. And, unfortunately, that stays true to today. And just, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is very much in the ether today, in the zeitgeist, the ACLU, who I actually was working for when I read it. And so I just thought it was, unfortunately, the 60s now were 60 years ago. But a lot of the things from that book, you could take and put in today, and you would not feel out of place or not be like, what, where did this come from? So I think what I'm trying to get at is, especially, people of my generation, 2015 and 2016 was just breathtaking. Just like, how is this happening in America? This is such a, these are end times. But we look back, and this is an historic part and a cycle that we go through in America. And if and fortunately now, in over the past decade, we started talking about the systemic impacts of racism and the systems that lead to racism, or that continue the racism. And that's what I want to talk about today. But I wanted to bring up this book to show, when people say there isn't systemic racism, that would be true if we couldn't pick up a book that talked about the 60s and brought the same issues that were there back then. This is a system, this is a culture, this is part of America. So I'm here to talk about systemic racism and how Passage Home, the work we do, how there's a huge intersection, right? So Passage Home is Wake County's anti-poverty organization. So poverty, if it wasn't systemic, should cut across race, should cut across religion, should cut across almost every other demographic, but unfortunately it doesn't. In Wake County, there are about 200,000 people living under 200% the federal poverty level. So that's essentially a living wage. In some data, they say for a family of four, you need to make around $70,000 to make a living wage. In the federal poverty level for a family of four, double the federal poverty level is 50,000. So there are 250,000 people in Wake County that live in a family that makes $50,000 or less. So, below a living wage. So you would think that's quite a bit, but unfortunately, Passage Home, who serves the entire county, 90% of our population are Black or African American. African American. So while there's a large portion of poverty in Wake County, almost all of our clients are Black or African American. And I want to talk about why that is. And so obviously, if we want families to make a living wage, we fight for them to get a better job. When you look at, and I'm going to ask a question here, when you look at job applications or job announcements, what's one of the first requirements you see on almost every living wage job?
Like a BA degree.
Yeah, education.
Experience, yeah.
Right, so an undergraduate degree, minimum of an undergraduate degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm going to speak in very broad strokes here, but besides doctors, lawyers, and MBAs, like most of us learn a lot from what we do on our job, right? Like our college education was important, but most of the work, our understanding of our work is on-job learning. And so what happened is a lot of companies realized if they put this arbitrary requirement on the degree, they know most of the people getting undergraduate degrees are white. The vast majority of people in America with undergraduate degrees are white. Does anybody know, I'm gonna ask another question, what percentage of Americans have an undergraduate degree?
No idea.
Anyone throw out a number? This is always fascinating to me.
28%.
All right, Pat, you cheated.
I would have said 25, but
Tracking it
Would've
since
thought higher.
it's only when I graduated it was in the 60s, it was 25%. It's only gone up 3% in decades.
Mhm.
So if you would have asked me this 8 years ago, I would be like 60%, 50%. Like the fact that it's just a little over 1 in 4 is amazing. Yet almost every living wage job tells you you need to have this to even thinking of applying for our job. And if you go to master's, it's 14%, doctor, it's 3%. So it's amazing that we still on almost every living wage job. And then does anybody know, and I've asked this question before, so anybody that has heard me speak before should know this answer. If you make minimum wage, you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, don't take an hour off. Does anybody know how much you're making?
33.
20.
$15,000.
Mhm.
725 times 40 times 52. So and now everybody here knows most of the minimum wage jobs are hourly. So if your kid gets sick, you want to take a vacation, you want to spend time with your sick mother, whatever it may be, you're not getting paid. So 40 hours times 52 times 72, 725, you are making $15,000 an hour. Where can you live in Wake County on $15,000 an hour? Okay. All right. So I'm kind of spitballing here, but I just wanted to kind of go over some of that basic thing. So I'm going to talk, I want to go into the cycle of poverty because that's what Passage Home does. is we work to break the cycle of poverty. It is our belief, and I'm just gonna talk a little bit about Passage Home right now. So we are a housing first organization. We believe that until a family is has safety and security through housing, they will not be able to focus on any long-term goals. And so I always equate it, when I went to school, sometimes I would skip breakfast before school, and then, I go through the morning, and then my period before lunch, whatever it was math or English. What happened, I would be focused on one thing and one thing only. I'd be focused on my food. What am I eating? I don't care what the teacher was saying. I'm not paying attention. I'm wondering if they're serving pizza or hamburgers at school lunch, right? Because my basic need of hunger was not met. Obviously, this was a choice. This is a very poor metaphor, but I think you get the understanding. If your basic need of housing is not met, if your basic need of safety is not met, how are you supposed to focus on any long-term goals? How are you supposed to focus on education? How are you supposed to focus on career opportunities? How are you supposed to focus on child development? And if you're a child and you don't know where you're going home to, who you're going home to, if you're going to have dinner tonight, how are you supposed to focus during school? And so we have an expectation as society, like pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But there's so much we're not providing for these families that, it doesn't matter what resources we give them. If their basic needs of safety aren't being met, we're not going to be able to help them. So Passage Home is a housing first organization. When it walks in our door, we either want to confirm secure housing, provide for secure housing, or maintain secure housing. Over the past year, we spent over $1.6 million in direct rent payments or hotel payments to help people stay housed. And typically, hotels is not acceptable for us, but during the pandemic, when congregate housing like shelters was a public safety issue, we put families in hotels. So once we get them in hotels, we work on education. Once we get them in secure housing, we work on education and job training to help them find self-sufficiency. So that's really quickly, that's our elevator pitch of who we are. But now I want to talk about who we work with. All right, so for so many in our society, those that work or live near the downtowns, especially Durham and Raleigh, and see a large homeless population. We see, you see a 25-year-old, and I'm just gonna, paint the picture and be vivid, and I'm gonna again paint in very broad strokes. You see a 25-year-old Black man on the corner, not dressed well and begging for money. As humans, we instinctively think like, oh, I feel bad, but what choices were made to put them in this situation? Or what disease does this person have to put them in this situation? And while some of that may be true, the truth is, I would change that question is, what has society done to put them in that situation? And the problem is, at 25 years old, we see that person as an adult, and we don't see what has led them to this. So I want to talk about what has led, and again, I'm just using a 25-year-old as a, straw man's not the right word, but, just someone to picture in your mind. So I'm going to use a Black family because we're talking about racism. We're talking about systemic racism and structural racism. So let's say this 25-year-old, let's go back 26 years to this 20-year-old is in utero. He has a single Black mom. Does anybody want to guess what the mortality rate for children born to Black mothers in America is in comparison to everyone else? Or I'm sorry, in comparison to white mothers, how much higher the mortality rate is for Black women than for white mothers in America?
3 times.
I think you guys did your research. So it's about 2.5 to 3 times. Now, you could say, well, maybe it's health choices, maybe it's biological differences, whatever it may be. But the truth is, America is the only country where there's this disparity between Black and white birth rates and mortality rates. So when you compare it to England, when you compare it to the Netherlands, Spain, wherever you might go, the only country that has this level of disparity is America. And so people have asked themselves why, and the best answer that they could come up with is the toxic stress created by racism in America has an impact on the mother's health. And this is the mother's mortality rate, not the baby's mortality rate. I'm sorry. So the odds of this young person, young man, being born without a living mother is 2.5 to 3 times greater than that of his white counterpart. And now you might say this has something, we talked about college education and that, there's a disparity between white and Black college education. They did the same research between women with college degrees, Black and white, and the same percentage held true. It had nothing to do with education. It had all to do with race. And so the best answer was that the toxic stress created by America causes this to happen. So let's say this 25-year-old kid now is 3 years old and his mother, let's say he's, one of the lucky ones, his mother survived birth. Does anybody want to guess the difference, the different amount of words, the average 3-year-old, not the total amount of words, the average 3-year-old growing up in poverty compared to the more affluent counterpart hears by the time they're 3 years old? So the total words they hear between 0 and 3, the total number, what the difference is between poverty and the more affluent counterpart.
Say maybe 10x.
10 times.
Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else have any guesses? So I don't know the percentage. They hear 30 million less words. 30 million less words by the time they're 3 years old. And this is, published a lot. So you can, look this up and you'll see it everywhere. So by the time this kid is 3, his auditory learning is far behind. And there's many reasons for this, right? Parents living in poverty have to work multiple jobs, so aren't home. Parents living in poverty have additional stressors. So they don't, I know when I'm having a bad day at work, I don't want to come home and read to my kids because I just want to come home and relax. And families dealing with the toxic stress of racism again. That stress that you go throughout the day are not gonna have their own bandwidth to read to the child. And we all know most of our learning done before the age of 3 is done auditorily. So that's how we hear things. So they're already behind the 8 ball by the time they reach age 3. And research over and over again shows how important pre-K schooling is before kindergarten. Pre-K is the age of 4. I mean, obviously you could do it before 4, but 4 is the year before kindergarten. And unfortunately, we don't have universal pre-K in most places in America. So once again, families living in poverty can't afford pre-K, can't get the additional support, can't read to the kids, don't have the bandwidth, don't have the time, don't have the luxury. So now the kids are joining kindergarten even further behind. But let's say, this kid's parents are extremely caring, really want the best for their kid. And so they say, we're gonna pool all of our money to make sure they can get to pre-K. To do that, they have to live in substandard housing in a substandard or a rougher part of the community. What that means, and there's concentrated areas of poverty all over America, where Passage Home is headquartered in South Park, used to be and still is to an extent one of those areas. So if you live in an area of concentrated poverty, you're surrounded by violence, you're surrounded by anger, you're surrounded by police sirens, and that included with the toxic stress of poverty is manifests itself in a kid as trauma. And trauma before puberty changes your brain. So the toxic stress we keep talking about changes your brain. So if you're living in a violent household, sexual abuse, neglect, Violence outside the house, you hear gunshots, one of your parents are incarcerated, divorce. These are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. This is a very common term now in child development. But if you experience ACEs before puberty, it changes your brain. And children ages 3 to 6 exposed to trauma, I'm going to talk about the way it changes your brain. Those who experience ACEs have difficulty focus or learning in school, develop learning disabilities, show poor skill development, act out in school situation, imitate the abusive traumatic event, become verbally abusive, and are unable to trust others to make friends, or unable to trust others or make friends. So these are all the things that affect a child by the time they hit first grade. But they go to first grade with all of these behavior issues. What's going to happen? They're going to get diagnosed with ADHD. They're going to get stigmatized. The teachers are going to suspend them. They're going to be, looked differently by their peers and their kids. So now we're not even at age 6. I've already talked about 4 ways the systemic things in America have impacted this kid. And if you look at the symptoms I just discussed, essentially before the age of 7, a child has developed PTSD because of the systems in America. And this is something that it's almost impossible to grow out of. So now you're 7 years old, you've fallen behind, you have trouble making friends, you're embarrassed, you feel stupid. So what do? You act out, you get in more trouble, you fall even further behind. And this goes on and on. So let's skip a few years. Imagine this kid struggling, but makes it to high school. Black students make up 15% of the student body in America. So 15%, I think that's about the overall population in America is about 15% Black or African American. Does anyone want to guess what percentage they make up of all suspensions in America?
I would say 80%.
Little high, 40%, but still like 250% of their actual population. So 15% population, 40% of all suspensions. Now we talked about that we're going to go back to the same kid who was diagnosed with a disability because of the trauma he grew up with, because of the systemic issues created by America, by housing affordability, by not having universal pre-K, by toxic stress, through racism, by living wage work and the inability for us to pay our families living wages. All this has resulted in the diagnosed disability. 12% of American high school students have been diagnosed with disability, yet they represent 25% of all suspension. Boys are 51% of the student body, yet they make up 70% of all suspensions. So Black, disability, male, 3 ways you can have an increased chance of getting an increased suspension. I'm going to get to why I'm talking about suspension as much. So imagine you're a young Black male with a disability, probably something similar to PTSD, going through American high school. Does anybody know what the American high school graduation rate as a whole is?
70%.
Very close, 75%.
75.
Again, I grew up in a lower middle class community, but I mean, I can't remember 2 kids that didn't graduate high school. So just shockingly no number that 1 in 4 people in America do not graduate high school.
Yeah.
Again, all of us in the triangle, we're lucky.
Right.
So I'm talking about suspension because here's a really interesting statistic. So that 75% graduation rate, that's for individuals with 0 suspensions. So if you have 0 suspensions in high school, you have a 70% graduation rate. If you get one single suspension in high school, your chances of graduating go down to 52%. A second suspension drops all the way down to 38%. A third suspension, 30%. A fourth suspension, 23% or less. So now you see male, Black, disability, more likely to be suspended. 1 suspension, you have a 1 in 2 chance of graduating high school. And anybody here heard of the prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline? So essentially, I mean, it is that we have all these school resource officers in school, which are essentially police officers. And what we used to get suspended for, now they're taking kids and putting them in prison, which is just further stigmatizing them. So it's a school to prison pipeline. It's just, just quicker. And again, Black males targeted by police, school students targeted by police, just more and more likely that the systems we're creating are just hurting our Black families up and down. So let's say, again, back to this 25-year-old kid, he's at the age he's supposed to graduate high school, but course of his life, he wasn't able to. So now he's a 20-year-old high school dropout with PTSD and other disabilities. And he has a child, finds a woman he loves or lusts after, and they have a child together. And what do you think happens to that child? Right back into the cycle that his parents were in. And that's really, so we hear the term cycle of poverty, we talk about the cycle of poverty, but that's what we mean when we talk about the cycle of poverty, the cycle that causes to stay in poverty. And it's a lot more, complicated and nuanced than that, but I just talked about this one specific kid. But as a society, we see this 25-year-old near the bus stop asking for money. And we're asking, what choices did they make to get here? Or what's their problem? Or just pick yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll get it. Or just find a job. Why can't you just go to work? Why is he so lazy? And the truth is, we as a society have not given them any of the tools starting at birth to do any of this. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about the housing side of systemic racism, we talk about the hospital side of systemic racism, we talk about the education side of systemic racism, but it's all of the above that lead to these cycles and so much more. So this is a story we see very commonly, at Passage Home. We're telling, it's our job to help these families find self-sufficiency. But there's so much toxic stress that they live with every single day through the different systems that they have to navigate. Now, if I got a speeding ticket, or I got wherever reason I had to go to the court or the town hall, or whatever it may be, I feel very comfortable walking in those places. That's one of the privileges of presenting white. For a lot of our clients, our families, they don't know where to start. They don't know where to go. And so that's really what Passage Home's job is to really provide them the support they need to help overcome a lot of these barriers. And for some, it's impossible. Or for some, it's really hard work because it's so ingrained in them. And it's something that started really before birth. And it's a challenge. And so when we talk about breaking the cycle of poverty, we talk about breaking the cycle of trauma. We talk about, it's unfortunate for a lot of our clients that are adults, it's a really uphill battle. So we want to make sure we're taking a multi-generational approach and helping the children, because the systemic issues of poverty start from day one. That overall is my talk about systemic racism. I can go into it a lot further. I can go into it, we talk all the way back to the 1600s, but I wanted to talk about what a lot of our clients face today, and really at a surface level, because it is so much more. I didn't know how much time I had allocated. I can talk longer, or I can just stop and answer some questions and have a conversation.
So I do have a question about, I understand breaking the cycle of poverty, but we first must break the cycle of trauma that these children go through. So what kind of programs or what outreach do you have for those children in the families that you're helping secure housing?
So we have
or what groups do you partner with to provide that help?
That's a great question. So we have a multi-generational approach to all of our programming. So we do work with single adults, but we also work with families. And if they have a family and the onus has to be somewhat on them. And we ask them how much they will be engaged with their children and their healthy development. So what our program does, we work with their children. We have a team of 4 caseworkers that are dedicated to children. Our main focus is their development, and that is not social, it's not emotional, it's not cognitive, it's all of the above. So when we get a client and their children, we do an assessment on them to see where their biggest needs are. For some, it's hunger. For some, it's mental health counseling. For others, it's tutoring, and everything in between. And so we assess them, we identify their needs, and then we do partner with really any and all Wake County organizations, from the food shuttle to different tutoring programs. We're about to launch a program called Teach for Reach, which is one-on-one tutoring, Triangle Family Services, which does a lot of mental health, Haven House, really anything we can. And we do partner with Wake County schools as well. And then we assess, we connect, and we stay in contact. So the average client stays with us for about a year. So we'll refer them out. We'll maintain contact with both the family and the referring partner to see progress. And then we'll measure progress every quarter and then kind of reevaluate what the needs are. And we also offer parenting classes, parenting support, and just basic need support along the way. We provide diapers to a limited extent, and really anything else that we can help the parents meet the needs of their children.
Seth, thanks so much for this presentation. And it sounds, like your organization is really taking a holistic view in terms of, helping the families and all the different members of that, and in a multiple number of ways. I guess I'd love to have your perspective on, what needs to happen further upstream. What the focus of your presentation was on the kind of systemic challenges that we've put in place, the disadvantages that we've put in place. So if you were to, what would you recommend as the priority changes that need to take place on a systemic basis to reduce homelessness and poverty downstream?
So, I think it's tough because there's so many, right? So when we talk about healthcare, it's representation. And I think that has a lot to do with while, Black families have worse health outcomes because they don't have doctors they feel comfortable going to, comfortable communicating with. A little anecdote that I always found interesting. Everybody know the automatic soap dispensers, automatic hand sanitizer dispensers. So there was one that if I put my hand underneath it, it would work perfectly. But if a Black hand went underneath it, it would never work. So what they realized, what all the people working on this project were white. And so they did everything to maximize its efficacy for their hands. But they never thought all hands won't look like ours. And so they had to go back to the drawing board. And I just use that little anecdote because that's very much with like healthcare, right? Like if we only test, if all of our doctors are white, and obviously all of our doctors aren't white, but still the vast majority are. So representation is one big thing. Affordable housing and education are so interrelated, right? And I think Wake County is one of the best school districts, especially one of the best large school districts in the country. And a lot of that is due to the busing, the magnet school system. But I think, figuring out a way to make sure that education, quality of education isn't tied to your zip code, I think is a big way. And, but I am also, my personal belief is that schools play a very minor role in child development. I've worked in some of the worst school districts in America, in Bronx, New York, and Paterson, New Jersey. And the schools are good schools. It's the environment, sometimes both in the hallway and outside of the schools, that really make it challenging. So when I talk about, crime being around and all those traumatic experiences that families face, I think that's a big issue. And I think affordable housing, Raleigh just passed the $80 million affordable housing bond, but that's not going to put a dent in the need. I think there's 60,000 units short in Wake County for families making $45,000 or less. And so without affordable housing, without that security, without the basic needs being met, it's impossible, because again, if your basic needs not going to be met, that's your main focus in and day out. So I think it's a great question, Rod, but I think it's all of the above. We have to focus on advocacy, and we have to focus on being honest with ourselves. Both, I'm going to make a prejudice statement on this group of us as white liberals. What do we have to do? How are we adding to this? And how can we advocate from our positions of power and educate people around us that, systemic racism is real, it's true. And every time we take a step forward, there's the other side trying to push us 2 steps back.
Seth, just following up on the affordable housing piece. So are there any strategies? You mentioned you're a housing first organization. And obviously there are organizations like Habitat that are working to build new units. What other strategies are there for, subsidizing rent, or I'm just wondering about that. How can we go about, promoting affordable housing in the short term, ideally?
So I think the big thing and the big movement now is discriminatory zoning.
Okay.
So when we talked about the college degree at the beginning of a job application or job posting, that was just, again, an arbitrary way to keep out undesirables, quote unquote undesirables. And so is discriminatory zoning, right? We have all these zoning laws, like only a single family house can be built here.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that is because for a long time, only white people could afford single family houses. So it was a way of being racist without being racist, or not outwardly saying you're racist. And so a lot of the zoning laws, I think, is the biggest way we could advocate. So Passage Home, we are developers too. We build affordable housing. We're about to break ground on a 200-unit affordable housing complex right off Martin Luther King and Garner in Raleigh. But let's say we have a small lot in Raleigh that's zoned for single family housing. Why couldn't we put a duplex or a quadruplex there to maximize the number of units and impact the number of families? And so I think advocating for decreasing the zoning regulation would be important. And there's always going to be positive and negatives to it. And I think, especially in the city of Raleigh and Wake County as a whole, we have some very friendly ears on the council and commissioners. And so they're working towards it. They just allowed for ADUs, accessory dwelling units in the city of Raleigh, where you can build by right a livable unit on your property that's half the size of your current unit. So if you own a 2,000 square foot house, you could build a 1,000 square foot house that you can then rent out by right. You don't have to get your zoning changes, which zoning changes can take up 6 to 9 months. And that's a big deterrent.
Seth, they've been really working on the zoning, and they have broadened it so that you can put a different kind of, like a duplex on a single family. However, if you do anything except a single family, you do have to do a site plan, which is additional regulatory stuff. So that's not very desirable for the developers who want to make a profit. And certainly single family homes are, the most profitable, probably.
And there's an interesting book, and I haven't read it, but someone told me about it, called The Price of Parking.
Oh yeah, Brett Federian from Canada is always talking about parking. We worship the cars.
Yep. And I think so. We're trying to build a single multifamily housing, about 70 units for seniors. But because of the housing rate, it says 1.5 units, 1.5 parking spaces per unit, which significantly limits our ability to build more housing.
Right.
Is it on a bus line?
It is on a bus line.
So they should reduce it.
Because the city has their own regulations, but the state, because we get funded through the state for this, it supersedes it. So it's a challenge. I mean, this is not something I'm intimately familiar with, but just some of the things that we've come up against.
I have a question
Yeah.
related to guaranteed minimum income, which I sort of look at. My personal perspective is that I look at Biden trying to back his way into that, not calling it that, but providing for a certain amount for children, if you have children in the home, and for the pre-K, the education. What do you think of that? Is that going to be the solution or one of the ways to lead from that? And before I turn it back over to you, I would like to say I was in Alabama when actually one time George Wallace was the best person to vote for. It was a terrible thing. But when you said what was his slogan, I thought you were going to use the one that he used when John Patterson defeated him, because by then at that point he said, "I will never be out inward again." And that was George Wallace. Later, things really changed and he became a different person. But at any rate, what about this backing into the guaranteed minimum income?
I know Andrew Yang, who's running for president, was a big proponent of universal basic income. I've read some articles that really are proponents and tell you how successful it is. And I just don't know, now we see this and where so many people aren't working because of the level of unemployment right now. And we're seeing this with our clients. And so it's frustrating, right? Because we're like, yes, you're getting money now, but it's going to run out. What are you doing to prepare yourself?
Yeah.
So that's put a bad taste in my mouth.
Interesting.
So and I've always been, I have a brother who's very much a pure capitalist. And we've gotten to arguments, about different safety net programs. And I've always been on the side, like they need this they need this to help them up on their feet so they can get to where they want to go. And, this has been very frustrating where people are getting this unemployment, but are not, and I understand if they go back to work, they lose the unemployment, but that's such a short-term thing, short-sighted solution. And so I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's this current moment in time has frustrated me, especially with our clients. Like, hey, great, you're getting, $100 more a month, but you're going to be getting $0 in a month in September. So
You
what can we do?
just kind of touched on the question I had, which was, for the last more than a year, thousands of people have been unemployed, but many thousands of those have been receiving unemployment checks and CARES. And it's maybe happening, but I have not heard one thing, we've not read one thing about people going back and virtually getting their GED or getting a training. Why not? What's the reason?
So, that's what we do. So we pivoted our workforce development program. So like I said, once we get them housed, we try to train them to have living wage jobs. And we see that as about $15 an hour. And we continue to try to do that. We had a conversation at work on this on Monday, and it's tough because we want to say, like, you're getting this money, utilize it smarter, budget, go back to class, do all these things, right? Like something we would do with our kids, like shake them by the shoulder and say, stop it, like stop spending your money on silly things. But the other side of it is kind of where I was in the conversation with the toxic stress that they've lived their whole lives. Now they have this moment of some sort of, I don't want to say luxury, but excess. Do we say, well, now that you have money, don't enjoy yourself?
We're only talking about a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours a day, and they're doing nothing. For 24 hours, they have nothing to do. And we're only talking about sign up for a class for 2 or 3 hours.
They might be doing childcare, or they might be working a part-time job, Pat.
But they're not doing it for 24 hours. And everybody doesn't have school-age children that are unemployed. But I haven't heard of anybody doing this now.
Well,
So,
I
I
know
mean, I
the
think-
community college has really been busy, but there's a charge to go. And if you're really not making a lot of money, you have to pay.
Yeah, but it's not that much and they're getting money. I can't believe it's impossible to afford to take 1 or 2 classes at your local community college somewhere in the United States. You don't even have to go to Wake Tech. You can go to Arizona Wake Tech or whatever, Arizona Technical Community College or Maine.
So Pat, I think, that's kind of that toxic stress and that lack of focus. For so long, they were unable to think of long-term goals because of the environment we put them in. And now as we expect them, like, all right, we gave you some sense of security, now start thinking of your long-term. It's just, it doesn't work, that it doesn't trigger that quickly for anybody living in poverty, right, to transition that way. But I do agree. And so there are organizations out there like us, and we're not the only ones. We offer full scholarships to training programs, including through Wake Tech. But it's tough to, live your life one way due to the environment we put them in for 30 years. And then all of a sudden during a national pandemic kind of change your thought process. It's a challenge. It is for sure.
Maybe if some media put the idea out there. I mean, I don't know, have any of them thought about it? Have they investigated it and found out that it's totally impossible for them?
Sometimes when you're in a situation, you're so paralyzed by it that you can't see what we feel may be very obvious to them.
Right.
You just can't see it. You can't move. So that's why organizations like Passage Home, Haven House, a number of these places that work with people are so important. But at the same time, the person may not even realize that there's somebody out there to help. And so where do you go? And that's where, the networking, maybe they know somebody and somebody will recommend, hey, I got help with such and such. But I think sometimes you're just so paralyzed, you don't know which way to go.
I would agree with that. And I would like to use an analogy that my husband and I saw when we were visiting in Africa. Actually, most of the things, and this was in South Africa, which was this particular story, which is definitely not a third world, or at that time was not a third world country. And yet there was no Black African leadership, because as we had been there as imperialists, they were never provided the opportunity to train. And Indians from India were brought in to provide. They were always the managers, the owners, because Black Africans had never had the opportunity to model how to do that. And I think the same thing is true in this country. With the systemic racism, how many of these people you're talking about have ever been exposed to me being able to make those kinds of decisions, or how you make them? My parents exposed me, but most of these parents don't have, I don't know, perhaps we might hear from our speaker about whether or not that's true. That I don't think that they have any way to model necessarily how to make those decisions.
That's very negative and depressing. It sounds like you're saying people can't change. There's
No, I'm not. I'm saying they haven't had the
situation.
opportunity to change.
The role models.
Right. They have had no role
Some
model.
examples.
And if they have it, they can change, but we don't provide it.
You don't think they get a role model
Seth, could I?
and on the television and movie, whatever they're exposed to? I mean, it's not like you were born 200 years ago and you never got outside your county and you never heard about anything other than what you grew up around a 3-mile square radius around you.
Well, I have a comment about that. back in 1970, when I moved with my mom and dad from Minnesota down to Clemens, North Carolina, right outside of Winston-Salem. I was in college. It's going to be a sophomore in college, but I had my sister and younger brother were going to high school. And the one thing that I found just unbelievable was now, this was a white school. Okay. I don't know, they may have had, if there were any Black children, there were probably just few, but the aspiration for after graduating from high school was to go to the beach, maybe Myrtle Beach, so you go out of state, and then probably right after, not too long after graduation, get married.
Well, remember, the graduation from college was only 25%.
Well, I know, but
We still are a minority.
what I'm saying is, it was the mindset that, and these were white kids, and the mindset was, this is what I know. This is,
And that's the
I'm not
majority
looking
of the
to go
people.
out and experience anything different.
That's the majority of the people.
Yeah, and I think, because poverty is, not a Black problem. I was using it as
Right, poverty, yeah.
Yeah, because like it's the same people in Appalachia, up and down the South that are struggling and probably not doing the same thing because they don't see the opportunity, they don't see the path. And for me, I have a master's degree plus some other things. Like when I see something, if I can't visualize the path or I don't know where to start, I get paralyzed. And then there's also the digital divide, right? I have broadband. I can take University of Arizona classes. And I still, my wife yells at me to get off Wi-Fi when she needs it sometimes because she needs, and so, there's a lot that goes to it, and it's unfortunate. And we've created, why isn't broadband a public utility at this point? I remember I was living in New York City, and for like 3 months when I first moved in, I had free Wi-Fi from the park. And all of a sudden they shut it off for no reason. And I can't imagine how many people that affected. So now you're spending $80 a month for a utility that you need.
Well, in Raleigh, when I just get incensed about my water bill because I use zero water at one place and it's $50. I mean, that's a lot of money when you're not making, what is unemployment now? It's the lowest in the country, I think, for North Carolina. That's a big chunk if you're paying your rent or not paying your rent and your electricity and all those things. I think getting an education isn't a luxury at that time.
Right.
Seth, let me ask a question. There have been a lot of big announcements lately about Apple moving, bringing a facility here, Google opening a facility here, and other companies, right? And there's obviously concern about the kind of pressure that may put on housing, and not to mention infrastructure and a lot of other things. But I guess I'm wondering, are you aware of any examples of cities around the country that have been able to kind of leverage those investments in a way that is more equitable, that that would lead to things like job training and affordable and investments in affordable housing and investments in public transportation? I guess I'm looking for, how can we take what appears to be pretty inevitable, these companies coming here, how can we channel some of that energy to benefit folks more equitably?
So the short answer to your question, Rod, is no.
Okay.
And that's the unfortunate thing, right? I think if there was a shining star, okay, everybody, let's go look at, Memphis, Tennessee. They've done a great job, but there's not one, city throughout the country. We've all tried different things, but there's really not one city that we can point to as the example. You know, and you guys, I'm sure everybody's seen in the news, LA struggles, New York struggles, San Fran, Boston, Austin, right? Every major city in America. And unfortunately, it seems like the hotter the city, the worse it is, right? Like
Yeah.
LA, everybody wants to move to. Poverty and homelessness is terrible. Portland, poverty and homelessness is terrible. Seattle, New York,
Atlanta.
Atlanta.
Mhm.
It's
And you
a
can't
struggle.
build that multi-story building near me because it's going to increase traffic. How
That's
does
right.
100,000 people not increase traffic?
That's right.
Well, this is very interesting conversation, and Seth, I think you've
Mhm.
stirred up a lot of questions. We want to thank you for being here, for being our speaker. We have a certificate of appreciation that we will email to you. We thank you for being here with us. Our